The security guard seized her by the backpack and shoved her against the checkpoint barrier, shouting for everyone to hear, "You don't belong here." Gasps rippled through the terminal as travelers turned, watching a young black woman stand frozen under a storm of suspicion. She said nothing. She didn't have to. Her skin had spoken before she ever could. A businessman in a press suit leaned to his companion, laughing. Another one trying to sneak into first class. Her badge was ignored. Her presence was unwanted. And every phone camera raised to capture the moment only fed the silent verdict already passed. She was guilty of existing where they believed she shouldn't. No one could imagine the truth, that the woman they humiliated wasn't just a traveler, but the mind behind everything they celebrated. She had built it all, and yet here she stood, unseen. What would you have done if you had been there? Stay with us, because this story will change the way you see the world. If moments like this make you stop and feel, don't just watch, be part of the voice that demands better. Hit like if you believe dignity belongs to everyone, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you don't miss the stories that matter. The morning sun cast long shadows across the newly completed Skybridge terminal, a marvel of architectural beauty that promised a future of innovation, equality, and world-class travel. Travelers bustled through its gleaming halls, dragging their rolling suitcases across the polished marble floors, their laughter and chatter blending with the distant echo of boarding announcements. The air was filled with a palpable excitement. This was opening day, the day the public would experience, for the first time, the terminal that had taken 5 years and $500 million to bring to life. Among the crowd was Keisha Thompson, a poised black woman in her early 30s, her style understated yet sharp. She wore a tailored navy jacket over dark jeans, carrying a simple black backpack slung over one shoulder. Her stride was confident, purposeful, but relaxed, as she soaked in the magnificence of the terminal she had helped to create, though very few knew it yet. At a security checkpoint near the VIP concourse, 2 officers stood watch. Frank Miller, a bulky man with thinning blonde hair and a permanent scowl etched into his face, and Deborah Simmons, a stern woman with a tight bun and sharper eyes than most hawks. Their task was simple: keep the area secure for the grand opening and ensure the special guests were treated with utmost priority. Keisha moved naturally toward the VIP entrance, pulling out a sleek black pass that gleamed in the light, a full access badge stamped with the words Investor Class Founder Circle. She had barely crossed the threshold when Frank's eyes locked onto her, his expression hardening. Without checking her pass, without even a cursory glance, he immediately stepped in front of her, extending a hand like a stop sign. "Hold it right there," he barked, loud enough for nearby travelers to turn their heads. Startled but composed, Keisha stopped in her tracks, offering her badge forward. "Excuse me, sir," she said with calm authority. "I'm authorized to enter this area." Frank didn't even look at the badge. His eyes, clouded by assumptions he had long stopped questioning, scanned her backpack and her face with suspicion. Behind him, Deborah approached with deliberate steps, eyeing Keisha as though she had just caught a shoplifter. "What's the problem, Frank?" Deborah asked, her voice low but edged with disdain. Frank chuckled under his breath. "Looks like someone got a little too ambitious this morning," he said, loud enough for Keisha to hear. Deborah smirked slightly and leaned in, muttering just loud enough for her partner. "You know how it is with their kind. Always trying to sneak into places they don't belong." The words, coated in venom, hung in the air like a bad smell. Keisha's hand remained extended, holding the badge out patiently, her posture unwavering. The glances from passers-by grew sharper, whispering judgments flickering across their faces. Keisha caught snippets. Maybe she got lost? Security's doing their job, not surprising, honestly. Inside, a storm brewed, but Keisha remained composed. Years of experience taught her that dignity was the sharpest blade. She knew how these moments played out, and she knew there was more at stake here than her pride. Frank finally snatched the badge from her hand, flipping it over lazily, and scoffed. "Founder's Circle?" "Right," he said sarcastically, tossing the badge back to her like it was trash. "This area is reserved for VIPs. Move along to the general boarding zone." Around them, the stream of travelers continued, none intervening. few even watching beyond a brief flicker of amusement or pity. Keisha caught her badge deftly, squared her shoulders, and looked Frank dead in the eyes. "Sir," she said, her voice steel-wrapped velvet, "I suggest you verify your records before making assumptions." But Frank, emboldened by Deborah's approving smirk and the seeming indifference of the crowd, stepped closer. "We don't need to check anything. You don't belong here." The words, once spoken, could not be unsaid. Deborah added, almost gleefully, "Better move along before we have to get serious." Frank reached for the radio clipped to his belt, preparing to escalate what was, in truth, his own mistake. In that suspended moment, Keisha saw it all: the ingrained prejudice, the unchecked authority, the careless cruelty. Yet she said nothing more. She simply slipped the badge back into her jacket pocket, took a small step back, and stood there, unwavering, daring them to dig their hole deeper. As the seconds stretched painfully long, a few more travelers slowed, sensing tension but not enough to involve themselves. In the distance, a young woman with a press badge paused, subtly raising her phone to film. Keisha noticed, but kept her gaze on Frank. Every heartbeat that passed solidified the trap they were walking into. And still, Frank smirked, certain he was right, certain she was wrong, certain, as always, that power was his by default. The opening day celebration banners fluttered overhead, a new era of equality and excellence. Yet here, at the very heart of this grand symbol, the old prejudices festered, ugly and rotting beneath the surface shine. Keisha exhaled slowly, steadying herself, knowing that every second of humiliation would serve a greater purpose soon enough. She was not just another traveler to be dismissed. She was the architect of their future, and their judge. The loop had been opened. Now all she had to do was let them fall into it themselves. For a moment, the air inside the terminal seemed to freeze, tension crackling like static between Keisha and the two guards blocking her path. Frank, fueled by a toxic blend of arrogance and insecurity, decided he needed to assert control, to reclaim his imagined superiority before the gathering crowd could question his authority. He puffed out his chest, his voice slicing through the bustling noise of the terminal as he shouted, "This is the VIP area, not a lost and found." Heads snapped toward the confrontation, curious faces turning like sunflowers toward the sun, drawn by the sheer spectacle of a black woman being publicly chastised in a gleaming temple supposedly built for equality. Keisha stood still, the badge in her pocket suddenly feeling heavier, the heat of dozens of judgmental stares pressing against her skin like a second, suffocating atmosphere. The embarrassment was immediate, sharp, and deliberate. Frank wanted a scene, and he was getting one. Near the front of the VIP security line, an older white man with silver hair and an expensive camel trench coat adjusted his sunglasses and stepped forward, emboldened by Frank's aggression. His name was Charles Dawson, a frequent flyer who wore entitlement like a second skin, his every movement exuding the certainty that the world existed to serve him. Mr. Dawson didn't hesitate. He pointed a manicured finger at Keisha and declared, his voice dripping with casual venom, "That's right. People like her have no business here." A murmur rippled through the nearby onlookers, a wave of quiet agreement and muted chuckles that felt louder than any shout. Keisha's stomach twisted, but her face remained a serene mask, the years of battling microaggressions and overt bigotry layering resilience over the raw nerves now crackling beneath her calm exterior. Frank, encouraged by Mr. Dawson's approval, smirked and took a step closer, violating the personal space that Keisha had guarded so carefully. "You heard him," Frank sneered, gesturing broadly as if addressing a courtroom. "This section is for VIPs, very important people. If you're lost, the public terminal's that way." He jabbed a thick finger toward the distant crowds, as if expelling her like an unwanted pest. Cameras and phones began to rise subtly among the gathering onlookers, drawn by the scent of conflict like moths to flame. Some passengers wore expressions of awkward discomfort, others smirked. A few simply looked away, unwilling to confront the quiet rut spreading in the midst of this pristine terminal. Deborah crossed her arms, her smirk thin and satisfied, her body language silently daring Keisha to protest, to make a scene they could then use as justification for even harsher measures. Keisha's heart pounded, the sharp, rhythmic drumbeat of anger and humiliation battering against her ribs. Every fiber of her being screamed to shout back, to unleash the righteous fury building inside her. But she remembered, always remembered, that real power often lay in patience, not retaliation. Instead, she tilted her chin up slightly, refusing to shrink under their gaze. Mr. Dawson, perhaps sensing that his cruel jab hadn't broken her spirit, leaned in toward a woman standing nearby and muttered loudly enough for Keisha to hear, probably just here to cause trouble. "They always find a way to mess things up, don't they?" His words oozed contempt, and once again, the nearby passengers absorbed them, digesting the prejudice and silently endorsing it through their passive complicity. Keisha's fingers curled tightly at her sides, nails digging into her palms, grounding her against the tide of rage threatening to spill over. Frank wasn't finished. He waved his hand dramatically, as if dismissing her existence entirely, and barked, "Security will be here in a minute to escort you properly. Until then, stand over there and stay out of the way." He pointed to a small corner near a trash can, a clear attempt to degrade her even further, to shove her physically and symbolically into a space he thought she deserved. Keisha didn't move. She simply stared at Frank, her silence heavier, more defiant than any words could have been. The seconds dragged out painfully, each one layering humiliation atop humiliation, like sediment settling on a riverbed. Slow, but inevitable. Mr. Dawson chuckled and shook his head, commenting to no one in particular, "Back in my day, this kind of nonsense would have been dealt with before it even started." A younger man standing nearby, possibly sensing the shift in societal winds, shifted uncomfortably but said nothing, his silence as damning as Dawson's words. Deborah tapped impatiently on her clipboard, pretending to check manifests, but really just avoiding the undeniable discomfort of the truth blooming all around them. Keisha's phone buzzed silently in her pocket, a message from the project manager confirming that the press conference was about to begin in the main hall. Perfect timing, she thought grimly. The irony was almost poetic. Even as she stood there being treated like a criminal, like a mistake, the building itself was minutes away from celebrating the future she had personally designed, funded, and nurtured into existence. Frank, still oblivious to the gathering storm, leaned toward Deborah and muttered, "Probably tried to fake a pass. Happens all the time. They think a little fancy paper and a smile can get them in anywhere." Deborah chuckled under her breath, and a few of the nearby travelers, emboldened by the uniformed guards' casual disdain, smirked or nodded approvingly. Every fiber of Keisha's being demanded action, but she knew the time wasn't yet right. Power, real power, required precision. She would not waste hers on shouting matches with small-minded people whose authority ended at the velvet rope they guarded so jealously. Still, standing there, bearing the full weight of their scorn, tested her beyond anything she had faced in a long time. Another voice piped up from the line, a younger woman with blonde hair clutching a designer purse, whispering loudly enough for effect. Maybe she's one of those activists trying to make a scene and get attention. Her friend giggled nervously, and the giggle echoed off the high ceilings, bouncing mockery back at Keisha with every reverberation. Mr. Dawson smirked and shook his head again, as if the very sight of Keisha was somehow offensive to him. An aberration in the polished dream world he believed first-class travel should remain. Deborah, Frank, Mr. Dawson, they all shared the same look, the same self-satisfied certainty that they were right, that they were better, that she didn't belong, no matter what papers or passes she carried. And Keisha knew, she knew, that soon, very soon, they would realize how wrong they were. But not yet. Not until they finished digging their own graves, word by ugly word, action by ugly action. Not until the stage was set perfectly. Until every eye in the building was turned her way, ready to witness not just their cruelty, but their downfall. So she waited, silent, composed, a lone figure standing against the gathering storm, even as the security officers and the entitled elite prepared to humiliate her further. The humiliation hung thick in the air, crackling with a dangerous static as Keisha stood her ground, refusing to flinch under the weight of Frank's contempt and Mr. Dawson's sneering approval. Frank, feeling the momentum tipping in his favor, decided it was time to escalate, to make a spectacle out of this woman who dared to maintain her dignity where he thought there should be shame. With an exaggerated show of authority, he pulled his radio to his lips and barked into it. "Officer Pete, we've got a situation at VIP Checkpoint 1. Need you here now." Within seconds, Pete Sanders, another security guard with a hulking frame and an aggressive swagger, approached from a side corridor, adjusting the cuffs hanging from his belt as he came. Frank met him halfway, leaning in to whisper just loud enough for others nearby to catch snippets. "Possible fraud, non-compliant. Need to secure immediately." Pete nodded curtly, already reaching for the handcuffs without a shred of hesitation or inquiry. Frank turned back toward Keisha, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth, and announced loud enough for the entire terminal to hear, "You're being detained for further questioning. Place your hands behind your back." Gasps rippled through the crowd like a physical force, a collective sharp intake of breath from travelers now riveted to the unfolding scene. Keisha blinked once, slow and deliberate, then reached calmly into her jacket, her movements precise and measured so as not to give them any excuse for violence. "Before you embarrass yourselves any further," she said evenly, her voice steady but carrying an unmistakable edge of warning, "perhaps you should actually check my credentials." She slipped a sleek black folder from her backpack and held it out, revealing a thick invitation embossed with gold leaf, the seal of the Skybridge terminal gleaming prominently at the top. It was not just any pass. It was a personal VIP invitation from the Skybridge Founders Committee, complete with her name, photo, and full investor clearance. For a split second, Frank hesitated, the doubt flickering across his face like a glitch in a poorly wired circuit. But Pete was already moving, his mind made up, his pride too fragile to consider he might be wrong. With a grunt of impatience, Pete slapped the folder from Keisha's hand, sending it skidding across the polished marble floor like so much trash. "Fake documents," Pete barked, his voice rough and dismissive. "I've seen better counterfeits in Times Square." Keisha's jaw tightened, but she didn't flinch, even as the precious folder landed at the feet of an elderly woman nearby, who looked down with wide, uncertain eyes but made no move to pick it up. Pete grabbed Keisha's wrist roughly, twisting her arm behind her back as he snapped one cuff into place, the cold metal biting into her skin. Frank crossed his arms triumphantly, surveying the scene as if he had just restored order to a chaotic world. Mr. Dawson chuckled darkly under his breath, shaking his head as if confirming to himself that the natural order had been preserved. "Told you," Dawson said to no one in particular, always trying to scam their way up. A young man standing near the velvet ropes fidgeted, looking down at his phone, clearly recording, but too cowardly to intervene. Keisha's heart thundered in her chest, each beat a drum of fury, not just at the injustice unfolding, but at the ease with which it was allowed to happen. The casual cruelty stitched into every action, every sneer, every dismissive glance. Pete yanked her other wrist roughly, fumbling with the second cuff as Keisha finally spoke again, her voice low, dangerous, and cutting through the noise like a blade. "You're making a grave mistake." Pete sneered without looking at her, his breath hot with the stale stink of arrogance. "Save it for the police report," he muttered, oblivious to the fact that with each second, he was tying the noose tighter around his own career. Frank leaned in, his breath heavy with smugness. "Bet you thought you could just waltz in here. Huh? Flash some fake papers and nobody would question it. Not today, sweetheart." Keisha said nothing in return, knowing there was no point. Words were wasted on men who had already decided who she was before she had even opened her mouth. She allowed them to finish the humiliation, knowing that each click of the cuffs, each barked order, each sneering insult would serve as undeniable evidence later. Pete jerked her arms behind her even tighter, unnecessarily rough, and began to lead her away from the security checkpoint, the crowd parting like the Red Sea around them. Deborah followed a few steps behind, her arms crossed, her smirk a permanent fixture now. Mr. Dawson watched with undisguised glee, muttering under his breath about keeping standards high and not letting the riffraff in. The folder containing Keisha's real credentials lay forgotten on the floor, an ignored beacon of truth in a sea of willful ignorance. Keisha caught the eye of a young flight attendant nearby, a woman whose face was twisted in visible discomfort. her mouth opening slightly as if to say something, anything. But the words died on her lips. Fear won over conscience once again. Pete shoved Keisha forward roughly, making her stumble slightly as they headed toward a small holding area near the edge of the VIP lounge, a room typically reserved for drunk passengers or disruptive guests, not respected investors. As they moved, a few people lifted their phones higher, recording openly now, the scene too explosive to ignore. Some whispered among themselves, speculating about what crime she must have committed to warrant such treatment. Others simply watched in silence, unwilling to challenge the narrative unfolding before them. Frank walked behind Pete and Keisha, barking orders into his radio to have the airport police meet us at Holding 3, his voice filled with self-importance. Pete kept one heavy hand clamped on Keisha's arm, ensuring she could neither turn nor move freely. Deborah trailed them, checking her phone casually, already crafting the version of events she would tell her supervisor if anyone asked later. Something about a suspicious individual. Refused to comply, possible forged credentials. Lies smooth and practiced, ready to be unleashed at a moment's notice. Keisha said nothing as they reached the holding room door. The hollow thud of the cuffs against her wrist, a cold reminder of the injustice bleeding out into full view. Pete fumbled with the keypad, impatiently jabbing in the code as Frank barked at a junior security officer nearby to get the paperwork ready for a trespassing and fraud report. In the distance, the faint crackle of the intercom announced the beginning of the Skybridge Terminal's official grand opening ceremony, a cruel symphony to accompany her public shaming. Keisha heard it but kept her gaze steady, her mind already calculating her next move, knowing the time to reveal her true hand was coming, and it would be devastating. The holding room door clicked open with a metallic groan as Pete shoved Keisha inside, her hands still bound tightly behind her back, the indignity of the moment weighing heavier than the steel cuffs biting into her wrists. Frank swaggered in after them, signaling triumphantly to the junior officer trailing behind to start preparing the incident report, his tone dripping with the smug satisfaction of a man convinced he had performed a public service. The room was sterile and cold, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly overhead, their mechanical hum the only sound for a moment as Keisha stood back straight, head high, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. Pete pushed her toward a metal chair bolted to the floor, barking, "Sit down," as if addressing a dangerous criminal, not a wronged woman whose only crime was daring to exist with dignity where they believed she did not belong. Just as Pete finished locking the second cuff to the steel loop on the chair, the door swung open with force, and in strode Mr. Lewis, the head of security, his pressed uniform gleaming with medals and authority, his demeanor exuding the unshakable certainty of someone who had spent decades climbing the ranks without ever once having his biases challenged. Mr. Lewis, a heavy-set man with a graying mustache and eyes like frozen steel, didn't ask a single question, didn't glance at the folders still lying discarded outside, didn't even allow a moment's consideration. Instead, he walked straight up to Frank, Pete, and Deborah, assessed the scene with a single glance, and then turned his cold gaze on Keisha. His lip curled in disgust as he sneered, "Get her out of here. Trash like that doesn't belong among decent folks." His voice was loud, purposeful, carrying easily into the hallway where more onlookers lingered, pretending to mind their own business while secretly drinking in the spectacle. He didn't care who heard him. In fact, he wanted them to hear, wanted the entire terminal to know that, in his view, Keisha was something dirty that needed to be swept away. Frank grunted in agreement, Pete nodded eagerly, and Deborah smirked as if Mr. Lewis had simply confirmed what they already knew. Keisha's eyes locked onto Mr. Lewis's, her gaze steady and unyielding, burning with a quiet, righteous fury that he either couldn't see or chose to ignore. He turned his back on her without another word, as if she had already been erased from existence. Meanwhile, in the nearby cafe just beyond the holding area, Annie, a young barista with a messy bun and a crisp white apron, leaned over the counter, whispering conspiratorially to her co-worker Jake, her voice low but dripping with derision. "Did you see that lady they dragged out?" Annie snickered, tossing a disdainful glance toward the scene unfolding across the hall. Looks like a homeless woman trying to sneak into first class. No way someone like that can afford anything here. Jake gave a non-committal grunt, focusing on steaming milk for a latte. But Annie's words hung in the air, absorbed by two middle-aged businessmen nearby who exchanged knowing smirks without a word. The rumor spread like wildfire through the nearby shops and lounges, whispered from one mouth to another, growing uglier and more exaggerated with each retelling. Some said she had tried to steal, others that she had forged credentials, still others that she had caused a disturbance. Truth mattered little now. The narrative had taken on a life of its own, fueled by prejudice, arrogance, and the intoxicating ease of condemning a stranger. Back inside the holding room, Pete uncuffed Keisha from the chair only to clamp her wrists again behind her back, roughly tugging her to her feet. "Let's move it," he barked, pushing her toward the door where Frank stood holding it open with a self-satisfied grin. As they marched her through the terminal, the whispers followed like a toxic cloud, a chorus of judgment that wrapped around Keisha like chains. Mr. Lewis stalked a few steps behind, his broad chest puffed with self-importance, his radio clipped to his belt squawking intermittently with updates he ignored. He didn't care about updates. He had already decided everything he needed to know. Passengers stepped aside to make room, some averting their eyes, others staring openly, phones raised discreetly to capture the scene for social media clout. Every step was a fresh assault on Keisha's dignity, but she refused to bow her head or let the anger bubbling inside her erupt. She knew better than to give them ammunition for the lies they would later spin. Near the exit, a woman in a navy business suit, sipping a cappuccino from Annie's cafe, turned to her companion and muttered, "Bet she thought acting all high and mighty would get her somewhere. Always trying to play victim when they get caught." Her companion chuckled, stirring his espresso without looking up. Frank caught snippets of these comments and felt bolstered by them, convinced that his actions were righteous, that the public approved, that he was some sort of gatekeeper defending the sanctity of the terminal from infiltrators. "Mr. Lewis's voice barked orders into his radio as he motioned Pete and Frank toward a side exit meant for maintenance workers and staff, not the glittering main hallways adorned with banners proclaiming Skybridge's commitment to innovation, inclusion, excellence. The irony was so thick Keisha could have choked on it, but she kept her face impassive, her mind laser-focused on what was coming. Behind them, Annie wiped down the counter with exaggerated motions, still gossiping to Jake about the scammer they had caught, weaving an entire story from thin air about how Keisha had probably tried to sneak into the investors' gala happening later that night. Probably thought she could blend in. Annie sneered, not realizing that the woman she was mocking was not only invited, but was the principal investor they would be honoring in mere hours. Jake nodded absently, but his eyes drifted toward Keisha's retreating figure, a flicker of doubt crossing his features that he quickly smothered beneath years of learned apathy. Mr. Lewis, Frank, and Pete reached the service hallway, shoving the door open with a clang and ushering Keisha through with unnecessary force. The hallway was dimly lit, cluttered with cleaning carts and discarded cardboard boxes, a stark contrast to the polished opulence of the main terminal. It was here, in the forgotten back corridors of Skybridge, that they intended to dump her without ceremony, without apology, without even the decency of acknowledging her humanity. Keisha stumbled slightly as Pete shoved her forward again, catching herself before she could fall. Frank followed closely behind, still grinning, while Mr. Lewis barked into his radio for someone to get the paperwork ready for a full ban from the terminal, the final nail in the coffin of their self-righteous crusade. Keisha inhaled slowly, drawing strength from deep within, knowing that every step deeper into this injustice would only make the moment of reckoning that much sweeter when it finally arrived. The service hallway reeked faintly of industrial cleaner and damp concrete, a grimly fitting backdrop for the indignity Keisha was being forced to endure. Mr. Lewis walked a few paces ahead, barking into his radio about needing a secondary security check immediately, his voice sharp with manufactured urgency. Frank and Pete flanked Keisha, their hands firm on her arms, guiding her like she was some dangerous fugitive rather than the woman who had, unbeknownst to them, funded much of the ground they were walking on. They reached a narrow door at the end of the hallway, marked with a simple security screening, authorized personnel only sign, and Pete shoved it open with his shoulder. Inside, the room was smaller and colder than the previous holding space, outfitted with a metal examination table bolted to the floor and a pair of overhead cameras that hummed quietly, capturing every humiliating second. Without a word, Pete forced Keisha toward the table, releasing one wrist from the cuffs, but keeping the other shackled while he barked, "Empty your pockets. Place all belongings on the table." Keisha's gaze flicked briefly toward the camera, filing away every movement, every insult for the reckoning she knew was coming. Wordlessly, she complied, pulling her phone, a slim leather wallet, and a set of car keys from her pockets, setting them neatly on the table's scarred surface. Frank stepped forward with a predatory grin, reaching for the black backpack that had remained slung over her shoulder until now. Without asking permission, he yanked it from her back and dumped it unceremoniously onto the table, scattering its contents. Sketches unfurled across the cold metal surface, sleek, complex architectural blueprints stamped with the Skybridge logo, alongside thick investment packets printed on heavy cardstock detailing projections, ownership stakes, and operational plans for the new terminal. The papers spilled out like a dam breaking, but Frank's eyes skimmed over them with disinterest, already searching for something more incriminating, something dirty that could justify their behavior. Pete grabbed one of the larger blueprint sheets, holding it up awkwardly, squinting as if trying to decipher some secret code within the meticulous lines and annotations. Mr. Lewis leaned over the table, poking at a glossy brochure outlining Skybridge's expansion strategy with the toe of his polished shoe. His face twisted in a sneer of disgust. "Looks like she grabbed some promo junk to look important," Frank snorted, shuffling through the papers with the back of his hand, uncaring of the creases and rips he left behind. At that moment, Chris, a junior officer barely a year into his job, entered the room carrying a portable scanner used for confiscated items. He was fresh-faced, eager to impress, and utterly lacking the confidence to question the authority of men like Frank and Lewis. Chris knelt by the table, gathering some of the scattered papers, his brow furrowing slightly as he noticed the heavy embossed seals, the fine quality of materials, the signatures at the bottom of certain investment agreements. Sir," Chris started tentatively, glancing up at Frank. "Some of these documents look official." His voice wavered under the oppressive weight of Frank's immediate glare. "Official?" Frank barked with a mocking laugh, snatching one of the investment summaries from Chris's hand and waving it carelessly. It's probably just some photocopied junk she printed off to look legit. I've seen better scams at airport kiosks." Without a second thought, Frank crumpled the sheet in his fist and tossed it onto the floor, where it landed among the dirt and dust accumulating in the corners of the room. Chris hesitated, clearly unsettled, but said nothing more, choosing self-preservation over integrity. Mr. Lewis crossed his arms, surveying the pile of crumpled documents with a look of profound satisfaction, as if this flimsy act of dismissal was proof enough of Keisha's guilt. "No ID badges, no security clearance, no boarding pass," Mr. Lewis declared loudly, ignoring the clearly visible VIP founder's pass tucked neatly into the side pouch of Keisha's backpack. "All we have here is a bunch of fancy-looking trash. Process her for trespassing and fraud." Pete nodded eagerly, pulling out a plastic evidence bag and beginning to sweep Keisha's belongings into it with rough, careless motions, mixing her wallet with the folded investment papers, as if they were all equally worthless. Frank grabbed the backpack itself and roughly turned it inside out, shaking it violently as though expecting contraband to fall out. Instead, a slim, bound presentation portfolio slipped free and slid across the table, its gold-embossed cover reading in crisp, unmistakable lettering, "Skybridge Terminal Phase 2 Expansion, Proposal Confidential Investor Copy." It lay there, gleaming under the fluorescent lights, the ultimate proof of Keisha's true identity and authority. None of them bothered to read it. Frank barely spared it a glance before scoffing and tossing it back onto the table in a heap, muttering, "More garbage. She must have dug it out of a trash can." Chris lingered near the door, shifting uneasily on his feet, his instincts screaming that something was wrong, that these documents deserved more scrutiny, but the fear of confrontation paralyzed him into silence. Pete finished stuffing the items into the evidence bag, giving Keisha a triumphant look as if daring her to protest. She didn't. She simply stood there, cuffed, humiliated, stripped of her possessions and her dignity, yet somehow radiating a calm defiance that unsettled even the most arrogant among them. Mr. Lewis snapped his fingers, gesturing sharply toward the hallway. "Bring her downstairs. Let the police deal with her. Maybe a few hours in a holding cell will knock that attitude down a peg." Frank and Pete hauled Keisha roughly toward the door, the crumpled documents forgotten on the floor, the discarded blueprints trampled underfoot as meaningless debris. Chris watched them go, a sick feeling pooling in his stomach, as he bent down and picked up one of the crumpled investment summaries, smoothing it out absently with trembling fingers, reading the line that named Keisha Thompson as principal founder and chief financial architect of Skybridge Terminal. The heavy door slammed shut behind them with a mechanical clank as Frank and Pete shoved Keisha into a cramped, windowless room tucked deep within the security annex of the terminal. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered ominously, casting long, warped shadows across the cracked linoleum floor. The walls were bare except for a faded poster outlining passenger rights, ironic in its silent accusation. In the center of the room stood a battered metal table and 2 chairs bolted to the floor, the setup resembling more an interrogation cell than any holding space meant for legitimate guests. Pete forced Keisha into one of the chairs, securing one wrist to a metal loop drilled into the tabletop with a pair of rusted cuffs that bit into her skin with every breath she took. Frank tossed a battered clipboard onto the table, the attached papers fluttering slightly before settling, the top sheet marked boldly in red ink. Statement of Compliance, Unauthorized Access Violation. Without ceremony, Frank leaned forward, jabbing a stubby finger against the form. "Sign it," he barked, his tone sharp enough to slice through steel. "A simple acknowledgement that you trespassed in a restricted area, no contest. Sign it, and maybe we'll let you walk out of here with just a warning. Refuse, and we call the police, and you can explain your scam to a judge." Pete crossed his arms, looming in the doorway like a silent threat, his posture daring her to resist. Keisha glanced down at the document, her jaw tightening as she read the carefully crafted lies printed in official black and white, the lines that would brand her as a criminal if she even touched the pen, now rolling to a stop near her cuffed hand. Every fiber of her being screamed against the injustice, but still, she remained composed, her expression unreadable, her mind calculating her next move with surgical precision. Frank misinterpreted her silence as hesitation born of guilt and pressed harder, lowering his voice into a sneering growl. "Come on," he hissed, "you know what you are. You don't belong here. This whole charade? Over. Sign the paper, admit what you did, and save yourself a trip to the county lockup." He chuckled under his breath, a low, ugly sound that carried the weight of decades of unchecked authority, of a lifetime spent believing he could crush people like her with impunity. Keisha raised her eyes slowly, pinning Frank with a gaze so cold, so fierce, that for a brief moment, the swagger in his stance faltered. But then he sneered again, masking his discomfort with bravado, and rapped his knuckles on the table. "Tick-tock, sweetheart," he said mockingly. "The cops aren't going to be as patient as we are." Outside the interrogation room, in the security lounge where off-duty officers lounged and sipped coffee, Frank strutted proudly, pausing to regale a small group of his colleagues with the tale of his triumph. "Yeah," he boasted loudly, his voice carrying across the tiled space. "Caught myself a real piece of work this morning. Thought she could just waltz into the VIP section like she owned the place. Flash a couple of fancy papers, act all high and mighty. Typical." His audience chuckled and nodded, absorbing the casual racism baked into every word, every inflection. Frank puffed up even more, savoring the attention like a cat preening in the sun. "Told Pete right away," he continued, "it's all smoke and mirrors with these types. They talk big, dress up nice, maybe print out some shiny brochures, but scratch the surface, and it's all the same underneath. Nothing but hot air." A junior guard, knew enough to still feel a twinge of conscience, shifted uncomfortably but said nothing, his fear of isolation stronger than his sense of right and wrong. Frank drained the last of his coffee and tossed the cup toward the trash can, missing by a wide margin. but he didn't bother to pick it up. Instead, he planted his hands on his hips, surveying the room with the smug satisfaction of a man convinced he had struck a righteous blow for real security. Back inside the holding cell, Keisha continued to sit motionless, staring at the form in front of her, her mind replaying every insult, every shove, every dismissive glance like scenes in a movie she would soon flip on its head. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second tightening the noose Frank and his ilk were so gleefully fashioning around their own necks. Pete leaned in through the doorway, his voice low and taunting. "You're wasting your time, lady. No one's coming to save you. You're just another fraud, another grifter trying to play dress-up in a world that doesn't want you." His words dripped with certainty, with the kind of entrenched bigotry that thinks itself invisible because it has been left unchallenged for too long. Keisha didn't flinch, didn't speak. She simply waited, letting the silence build, letting their arrogance pile higher with every breath they took. Frank glanced through the small window in the door, noting her stillness, and laughed again, turning back to his audience in the lounge. "She's probably trying to think of some sob story," he said, slapping his thigh in amusement. "Daddy issues, grew up rough, wants a second chance. Boo-hoo. Heard it 1,000 times. Ain't nobody buying it." He paused dramatically, savoring the moment. "Lucky we caught her before she pulled something bigger. Bet she thought she was real clever." The others nodded along, their laughter low and mean, a shared ritual of dominance rooted in their shared assumptions. None of them noticed the junior guard from earlier, Chris, hovering near the far wall, the crumpled investor summary still folded carefully in his pocket, a growing pit of unease gnawing at his gut. None of them saw the way he kept glancing at the security monitors, at the flashing message indicating that senior airport administration was inbound, summoned by a very different chain of events already set into motion far beyond their control. Back inside the holding room, Keisha shifted slightly in her chair, the chains clinking softly as she moved, her eyes narrowing as she heard the muffled echoes of Frank's boasts through the walls. Her time was coming. It was almost here. The clock on the wall ticked in slow, mocking beats as Keisha remained seated, refusing to touch the confession form, her presence radiating a stillness so unsettling that even Pete began pacing outside the holding room, glancing uneasily at the security lounge where Frank continued regaling his co-workers with embellished versions of the morning's events. Mr. Lewis, meanwhile, had taken upon himself to escalate the matter, pulling out his phone to place a call directly to the Skybridge Terminal's executive liaison, intent on bragging about how quickly his team had neutralized what he saw as a potential security breach during the grand opening. He punched in the number, his chest swelling with self-importance, his voice rising with every word. "This is Chief Lewis at VIP Security," he barked into the phone, ensuring everyone around heard him. "We've apprehended an individual attempting to infiltrate the investors' area, likely looking to disrupt today's ceremony. You'll want to let the head of investments know we've handled it." He paused, nodding proudly at Frank and Pete, who grinned and exchanged high fives as if medals were being pinned to their chests. Moments later, down the gleaming marble corridor outside security, a flurry of commotion erupted as several black-clad administrators hustled toward the annex, their polished shoes clicking sharply against the floor. At their head was Ms. Evelyn Grant, the newly appointed CEO of Skybridge International, a woman renowned for her sharp intellect, unforgiving standards, and zero tolerance for incompetence. Her tailored navy suit moved crisply with each purposeful stride, her assistant struggling to keep up as she checked her tablet for the morning schedule. The call had pulled her straight from the VIP lounge, where she had been finalizing last-minute press details for the ceremony. Frowning deeply, Ms. Grant rounded the corner and entered the security suite, the laughter and boasting inside dying abruptly as the weight of her presence filled the room. Mr. Lewis straightened his jacket, puffed up with pride, stepping forward to greet her like a conquering hero. "Ms. Grant," he announced loudly, "no need to worry, we've contained the situation. Some troublemaker tried to sneak into the founders' event. But don't worry, we kept your investors safe." He gestured broadly toward the locked holding room where Keisha sat, still bound to the table, her expression calm, watchful. Ms. Grant's sharp gaze followed his hand, narrowed slightly, and then shifted back to Lewis with an unreadable expression. "Really?" she said flatly, her voice slicing through the air like a scalpel. "Let's see this troublemaker then." Mr. Lewis nodded eagerly, signaling Frank to unlock the door. Frank moved quickly, his keys jingling in his hand, eager to present the fruit of his prejudice like a trophy. As the door swung open, Ms. Grant stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum, and finally laid eyes on the woman inside. The reaction was immediate, visceral. Ms. Grant's face drained of color, her breath caught audibly in her throat, and her tablet clattered to the floor, forgotten. She stared at Keisha for a beat too long, horror dawning across her features as realization slammed into her with brutal force. Then her voice, usually so composed, erupted in a fierce, incredulous shout that echoed down the hallway and froze every soul within earshot. "Do you have any idea who she is?" The security lounge fell into stunned silence, the bravado and laughter snuffed out in an instant. Mr. Lewis blinked rapidly, glancing between Ms. Grant and Keisha, his mouth opening and closing like a beached fish, utterly lost. Frank stepped back instinctively, as if distance could protect him from the tidal wave bearing down on them. Pete's face paled visibly, and he shifted awkwardly, looking anywhere but at Keisha. Ms. Grant stormed into the room, her voice low and lethal now as she addressed the stunned guards. "That woman," she hissed, "is Keisha Thompson, principal founder, chief financial architect of the entire Skybridge terminal." Her words struck like hammer blows, each syllable stripping away the false narratives they had so gleefully constructed. She spun on Mr. Lewis, her fury barely contained. She funded this terminal, $500 million of private capital. She is the reason this building even exists. Chris, standing near the door with a crumpled investment sheet still stuffed into his pocket, flinched visibly, the enormity of the mistake hitting him like a physical blow. Frank opened his mouth, some feeble protest bubbling up, but Ms. Grant cut him off with a glare so fierce he recoiled. Keisha finally moved, slow and deliberate, extracting her now slightly crumpled black folder from the pile of evidence Pete had so carelessly mishandled earlier. With exquisite calm, she opened it and laid the original signed contract flat on the table, the Skybridge terminal's golden seal gleaming under the overhead lights. Across the top in bold block letters were the words "Investor of record Keisha M. Thompson, sole principal partner." For good measure, she placed her official founder's Circle Access badge beside it, its holographic ID flashing under the fluorescent light. No one in the room could deny it now. No one could hide behind flimsy excuses or pretend they hadn't seen. Keisha sat back, her hands folded neatly on the table, watching with quiet satisfaction as the full scope of their folly unraveled before them, every insult, every shove, every sneer collapsing under the weight of undeniable truth. Ms. Grant rounded on Mr. Lewis, her voice shaking with rage. "You detained her. You assaulted her. You humiliated her. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Mr. Lewis looked like he might faint, sweat beading on his forehead as he stumbled over half-formed apologies. Frank stood frozen, his hands twitching helplessly at his sides, while Pete's face turned a deep, sickly shade of red. Keisha said nothing. She didn't need to. The truth spoke louder than any words ever could. And yet, as the full impact of their actions began to dawn on the men who had so casually tried to destroy her dignity, Keisha knew the reckoning had only just begun. The silence in the room was deafening, each second stretching unbearably as Mr. Lewis, Frank, and Pete struggled to process the magnitude of their mistake. But the fallout was only beginning because at that very moment, down in the main control center of the terminal, another storm was brewing. Unbeknownst to the security team, the entire series of events, Frank's aggressive stop, Pete's rough handling, Lewis's vile orders, had been captured in real time by multiple security cameras stationed throughout the VIP checkpoint and the auxiliary halls, their silent lenses recording every insult, every shove, every illegal detainment. It had taken mere minutes for a junior technician monitoring the feeds to recognize something was terribly wrong and to discreetly pull the footage, forwarding it to the Public Relations Emergency Response Team who had been stationed on site in case of grand opening disruptions. Within 30 minutes, edited clips from the security footage had leaked online through anonymous sources, showing with brutal clarity the full arc of Keisha's mistreatment. First, a short clip surfaced on Twitter. Keisha being stopped, badge ignored, shoved toward the back hall. Then, a longer video appeared on TikTok. Frank mocking her, Pete manhandling her, Mr. Lewis sneering about trash not belonging here. By the time Ms. Grant was confronting the security team upstairs, the videos had gone viral, racking up millions of views and igniting a firestorm of public outrage. Headlines screamed across every platform. Investor detained at her own airport terminal, racial profiling at Skybridge opening day, founders' rights violated by security team. Comments flooded in by the second, a tidal wave of anger and disbelief. Influencers, celebrities, and civil rights organizations picked up the story, tagging the official Skybridge account in blistering posts demanding accountability. Protest hashtags trended worldwide. Hashtag Justice for Keisha. Hashtag End Racial Bias. Hashtag Skybridge Scandal. Meanwhile, at the terminal, Ms. Grant's assistant stumbled into the security room clutching her tablet, thrusting it toward Ms. Grant with wide, panicked eyes. "You need to see this," she gasped. Ms. Grant snatched the tablet and scanned the headlines flashing across the screen, her jaw clenching tighter with every passing second. Mr. Lewis tried to stammer out a defense, something about misunderstanding, confusion, miscommunication, but Ms. Grant held up a hand to silence him, her face like stone. Across the table, Keisha sat perfectly still, her calm composure now a blade sharper than any words. She could feel the shift in the room, the irreversible current dragging all their lies into the harsh light of day. Yet she remained silent for another long moment, letting the magnitude of their downfall sink deep. Finally, as Ms. Grant turned back toward her, apologizing profusely with a voice thick with genuine horror, Keisha spoke for the first time since the revelation. Her voice was low but resonant, cutting through the tension like a bell tolling in a quiet church. "Do you know why I invested in Skybridge?" she asked quietly, and though the question seemed rhetorical, everyone in the room held their breath, waiting for her to continue. She rose slowly from the chair, gathering the scattered documents into a neat pile with deliberate care, her hand smoothing the creased pages that had been treated like garbage just an hour earlier. "Years ago," Keisha said, her voice steady and calm, "I passed through this airport on my way to my first major business pitch. I was young, driven, full of hope." She paused, her eyes locking onto Frank's, then Pete's, then Mr. Lewis's, holding them captive. "I was stopped at security, without cause, pulled aside, questioned, humiliated, simply because I didn't look like I belonged in first class." A heavy silence fell over the room, thicker and more suffocating than before. Frank shifted uncomfortably. Pete glanced down at his boots, and Mr. Lewis looked anywhere but at her face. That day, Keisha continued, her voice gathering strength like a wave rising from the ocean depths. "I promised myself that one day I would build a terminal where no one, no matter their skin color, their background, or their style, would be treated like they didn't belong." She turned slightly, sweeping her hand around the room, as if encompassing the very building itself. Skybridge was supposed to be that place. Ms. Grant bowed her head slightly, shame radiating off her like heat. Chris, standing awkwardly at the edge of the room, swallowed hard, realizing with sick certainty the scale of the betrayal he had been part of by staying silent. "I poured $500 million into this project," Keisha said, her tone unwavering, not for power, not for prestige, but to create a space where dignity was the foundation, not a privilege reserved for a few. Her words settled heavily over everyone present, each syllable exposing the rot they had allowed to fester in a place meant to symbolize hope. Frank looked like he wanted to disappear, his bluster and arrogance crumbling into dust. Pete's face was now a mask of horror and Mr. Lewis's shoulders sagged visibly, the weight of the consequences looming larger with every breath. Yet Keisha wasn't finished. She stepped forward, pulling a small device from her jacket pocket, a Bluetooth connection to the terminal's internal announcement system, and with a few swift motions, linked her phone to the speakers humming throughout Skybridge. A soft chime rang overhead, and then her voice echoed across the grand terminal. reaching every corner where passengers bustled. News crews set up cameras, and administrators scrambled to contain the PR nightmare unraveling before their eyes. This terminal, Keisha's voice proclaimed, calm and commanding, was built on the promise of equality, dignity, and respect for all. Let today be a reminder. Appearances are deceiving, but truth always rises. Always. The words hung in the air, searing into the consciousness of every person who heard them. Outside in the main hall, spontaneous applause erupted from scattered pockets of travelers who had seen the viral footage and realized the gravity of what had happened. In the security room, Ms. Grant stood frozen. Chris wiped tears from his eyes, and Frank, Pete, and Mr. Lewis realized there would be no hiding, no covering up, no easy redemption. Their downfall had been written in real time, broadcast to millions, and no apology could erase what they had done. The repercussions were swift and merciless, moving through the Skybridge terminal like a shockwave as the magnitude of the scandal became undeniable. Within minutes of Keisha's broadcast announcement echoing across the concourse, Ms. Grant's executive team, under the mounting pressure of media scrutiny and public outrage, convened an emergency meeting right there in the security suite. Ms. Grant herself, her face grim and resolute, stood at the head of the group, flanked by legal counsel and the newly arrived airport authority officials who wasted no time in asserting control over the escalating crisis. Frank, Pete, Mr. Lewis, and Deborah were summoned individually into a side room, where stern-faced HR officers and legal representatives awaited them, documents already printed and clipped neatly into folders marked "Immediate Suspension Pending Investigation." Frank tried to bluster, waving his arms and insisting it was all a misunderstanding, that he had followed protocol, that he was being targeted unfairly. But his words bounced off the stone faces of the officials like pebbles thrown at a fortress. Pete barely managed a strangled protest before he was cut off with a curt command to sit down and sign the paperwork. Mr. Lewis attempted to leverage his years of service, citing all his previous awards and commendations, but the official simply slid a letter across the table stating clearly that effective immediately, he was suspended without pay and under review for permanent revocation of his security clearance and operational certifications. Deborah, who had remained silent up until now, tried a different tactic, adopting a weepy, apologetic tone, blaming confusion and stress. But her crocodile tears earned her no mercy. Each of them was handed a letter of suspension, stripped of their badges, their access cards, and escorted by uniformed airport police to a side entrance. Their heads bowed in shame as cameras from the press captured every humiliating step. Within the hour, a memo circulated internally at Skybridge stating that all four individuals, Frank Miller, Pete Sanders, Deborah Simmons, and Chief Security Officer Ronald Lewis, were officially barred from accessing any airport facility pending a full external investigation, with a very real possibility of being blacklisted from working in aviation security nationwide. As the disgraced officers disappeared into the bowels of the terminal, a new flurry of activity overtook the main hall. Large screens that had been set up for the opening day celebration were quickly repurposed for an emergency press conference, the Skybridge logo prominently displayed behind a hastily arranged podium. Dozens of reporters from local, national, and even international outlets swarmed the press area, microphones and cameras jockeying for position as the buzz of furious typing filled the air. The public relations team, faces drawn and pale, coordinated feverishly behind the scenes, pushing out a statement acknowledging the incident and promising full cooperation with any investigations. Precisely at noon, Ms. Grant emerged onto the makeshift stage, her expression one of solemn responsibility. She approached the podium, adjusted the microphone, and took a deep breath before addressing the packed terminal. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice clear and unwavering. "Today, on what should have been a celebration of innovation and unity, we instead stand here to confront a deep and painful failure." The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in immediately. Earlier this morning, one of our most esteemed partners, Ms. Keisha Thompson, was subjected to unacceptable treatment by members of our security staff. She continued, pausing only to steady her voice, which trembled with restrained anger. On behalf of Skybridge Terminal, its board, its investors, and every member of its leadership, I extend our deepest, most sincere apology to Ms. Thompson. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as flashbulbs popped and video feeds streamed live across the globe. Ms. Grant glanced briefly toward Keisha, who stood composed and dignified at the edge of the stage, surrounded by a small protective team of Skybridge executives. "We have taken immediate disciplinary action," Ms. Grant declared, her tone sharpening, "and we have initiated a comprehensive review of all security protocols and staff training procedures. We are committed to ensuring that what happened today will never happen again. Not here, not anywhere." A smattering of supportive applause broke out among the crowd, quickly growing into sustained clapping as people recognized the gravity and sincerity of her statement. Ms. Grant stepped aside then, extending a hand in silent invitation toward Keisha, who walked forward with the unhurried grace of a queen taking her rightful place before her people. As Keisha took the podium, the applause swelled again, but she lifted a hand gently, signaling for quiet. The crowd obeyed instantly, leaning forward, eager to hear from the woman at the center of it all. Keisha's eyes scanned the room slowly, taking in the sea of expectant faces, the flashing cameras, the raw attention focused solely on her. When she spoke, her voice was measured and profound. "Today is not about revenge," she began, her tone resonant and clear. "It is about responsibility. It is about recognizing that progress is not measured only by how high we build our structures, but by how deeply we honor the humanity of every person who walks through them." The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional soft click of a camera shutter. "This terminal was meant to symbolize opportunity," Keisha continued, her voice rising slightly, a beacon for everyone, regardless of their background. "What happened today shows us that the work is far from finished. True change demands vigilance, it demands courage, and most importantly, it demands humility." Several reporters wiped away tears discreetly as Keisha paused, her words hitting harder than any condemnation could. "We must do better," she said simply, "and we must hold each other accountable, not just today, but every day." She stepped back then, nodding slightly in acknowledgement of the standing ovation that erupted across the terminal. Even some of the staff who had earlier stood by silently now clapped with heads bowed in shame or regret, realizing the depth of the injustice that had been exposed. As the applause washed over her, Keisha remained still, rooted like an immovable pillar amidst the swirling tide of emotion, knowing that the real battle, the fight for dignity and true equality, was only just beginning. The days that followed were a whirlwind of public apologies, corporate reforms, and social media campaigns pledging to do better. But beyond the blaring headlines and televised interviews, quieter transformations were beginning to take root, starting with those who had stood at the heart of the storm. Frank Miller, once the swaggering face of Skybridge's security division, found himself at a complete standstill, blacklisted from airports nationwide. He was forced to confront the stark reality that his actions had destroyed the career he had spent 2 decades building. At first, Frank was furious, railing against what he saw as unfair punishment, blaming everyone but himself. But slowly, uncomfortably, the words from Keisha's speech began to gnaw at the corners of his mind, replaying when he least expected it, the call for responsibility, for humility, for real change. Alone in his tiny apartment, stripped of the uniform that had once defined him, Frank made a choice he never would have imagined before. He enrolled in a community college's evening program on racial bias and cultural competency. At first, he sat in the back of the classroom, arms crossed, skeptical of the young, passionate professor who spoke about systemic injustice and unconscious prejudice. But week after week, something inside him shifted. He began to see patterns he had once ignored, began to understand that racism wasn't always shouted. Sometimes it was embedded silently into instincts and assumptions. By the end of the course, Frank stood up in front of his classmates, people he once would have dismissed, and choked out an apology, not just for what he had done to Keisha, but for the many unseen ways he had contributed to the cycle of harm. He didn't stop there. Inspired by the sense of duty that had first drawn him to security work years ago, Frank began volunteering with local organizations advocating for racial justice, using his own story as a cautionary tale, speaking at youth centers and town halls about how easy it was to become part of the problem, and how hard, but necessary, it was to choose to become part of the solution. Meanwhile, Deborah Simmons, who had once smirked so confidently as Keisha was dragged away, faced a quieter, but no less painful reckoning. Unable to find work in airport services and shunned by many former colleagues, she retreated inward, spending long, sleepless nights replaying the images that had been broadcast worldwide. The look on Keisha's face, the quiet dignity she had maintained, the devastating grace with which she had revealed the truth. Unlike Frank, Deborah didn't immediately seek education, but the guilt weighed heavily on her, wearing her down until one evening, while scrolling aimlessly through social media, she stumbled across a scholarship fund started by a small community group aiming to send minority students to college. Something inside her cracked open. With the severance pay she had received upon termination, Deborah made a decision. She would start a fund of her own, a scholarship specifically for young black students pursuing degrees in law, business, and public administration, fields where representation mattered deeply. Naming it the Dignity Scholarship in honor of the resilience Keisha had shown, Deborah spent months working with nonprofit organizations to ensure the fund was administered transparently and responsibly. She didn't seek credit or forgiveness. She simply did the work, believing that small acts of repair were better than hollow words. Mr. Lewis, once the commanding and feared chief of security, found himself grappling with the deepest reckoning of all. A lifetime of pride in his discipline, his authority, his sense of right and wrong shattered the moment Ms. Grant had uttered those damning words in front of Keisha and the world. Losing his position and professional reputation felt like a death in itself, but the shame he carried was heavier still, a constant companion he could neither outrun nor drown out. It was a chance encounter with a former colleague, a retired officer turned community organizer, that set him on a different path. Over coffee in a dingy cafe far from the gleaming terminals he once ruled, Lewis listened as his old friend spoke about the importance of building trust, about the need for spaces where those historically marginalized by systems of power could gather, learn, and lead. The idea took root in Lewis's mind and refused to let go. Digging deep into his savings, money he had planned to leave untouched until retirement, he partnered with a community group to establish the Bridge Center, a nonprofit aimed at providing training, mentorship, and advocacy resources for young people of color aspiring to careers in law enforcement, security, and public safety. He insisted on no titles, no recognition. He wanted the center to stand for something bigger than his own redemption, something that might one day tip the scales of justice, even slightly, in the right direction. Across the city, articles began to appear, not about scandal or disgrace, but about transformation. Reports of Frank speaking to high school students, of Deborah awarding scholarships to bright young scholars, of Lewis standing quietly at the back of rooms while young leaders he had helped support took the stage to demand a better future. At Skybridge Terminal itself, change was no longer just a promise on glossy banners. It was woven into the fabric of daily operations. New policies emphasized restorative justice, diversity training became mandatory at every level, and a permanent plaque was installed in the VIP concourse, engraved with words Keisha had spoken that day. Dignity is not a privilege. It is a right. Keisha herself declined offers of leadership positions at the terminal, choosing instead to serve on the advisory board, guiding from a place of principle rather than ambition. Her focus shifted toward expanding her foundation, supporting other marginalized entrepreneurs to rise without apology, without fear. In the grand hall of Skybridge, sunlight streamed through the towering glass walls, illuminating travelers of every background, every story moving freely, equally, as they had always deserved. And those scars remained, as they always would. There, in that space built from resilience and hope, redemption had taken root, proving that even the deepest wounds could give rise to something stronger, something better, when faced with courage, humility, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. If you were moved by Keisha's journey and believe in standing up for justice, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that inspire change. We want to hear from you. Which moment in Keisha's story impacted you the most? And tell us in the comments. Where are you watching from today? Your voice matters, and we're listening.